Before we go inside the New Covenant community, which is what the organization at the center of this story called itself for the 14 years of its active operation, I want to establish one ground rule for how we approach this. The people who joined this organization were not naive. They were not gullible in the ways that outsiders assume victims of high control groups must be, because that assumption is how we distance ourselves from the possibility that we might have made the same choices in the same circumstances. The people who joined the New Covenant community were doctors, teachers, engineers, parents, young adults looking for community, middle-aged people looking for meaning, and elderly people looking for connection. They were people, and the person who recruited them knew exactly which version of the invitation would work on each one. The New Covenant community was founded in 2003 by a man named David Holst, who had previously been an associate pastor at 2 separate evangelical churches, from which he had departed under circumstances that neither church ever publicly discussed. He established the New Covenant community not in a church building, not in a residential compound in a remote location, both of which are the settings that popular culture has trained us to associate with dangerous religious organizations, but in a suite of retail spaces on the second floor of a suburban shopping mall in an Ohio commuter town. The spaces had been vacant for 2 years. The mall's management was grateful for the rent. Holst signed a 5-year lease. The mall location was not incidental, it was strategic. A suburban shopping mall in a commuter town is the most ordinary environment available. People walk through it to buy things. It contains a food court, it has parking, it has a children's play area. It is the architectural embodiment of the unremarkable. David Holst understood that the most effective recruitment environment for a high-control religious organization is one that does not trigger the pattern recognition alarm that remote compounds and charismatic street preachers trigger. The mall was invisible in the way that the ordinary is always invisible. And the invitation that went out through the town's community notice boards, neighborhood Facebook groups, and workplace bulletin boards in the spring of 2004 reflected the same logic. Community of meaning, a gathering for people seeking purpose, connection, and authentic community. Free coffee, no pressure. Second floor, Westfield Commons Mall, Suite 208. Rachel, a former member who left in 2015 and has since become an advocate for cult education, described her first visit this way. I went because a woman from my gym mentioned it twice. I wasn't looking for religion. I wasn't spiritually lost. I was just curious, and it was a Saturday, and I figured I'd stop in on my way to the grocery store. There were about 30 people there, all ages, all kinds. It felt like a community center, not a church. Nobody talked about God for the first 20 minutes. They talked about what was hard about living in the modern world and feeling disconnected. And I thought, this is just a discussion group. This is fine. I came back the following Saturday. In cult psychology, love bombing is the practice of overwhelming a new recruit with positive attention, affirmation, and belonging signals at a rate and intensity that would not be sustainable in an ordinary human relationship. The term exists because researchers identified the pattern across dozens of high-control groups and needed a consistent vocabulary for it. But the term makes it sound calculated in a way that misses something important. For many of the people doing the love bombing, the warmth they are expressing is genuinely felt. They have been inside the group long enough to have their emotional responses trained toward new members. They have been taught, explicitly or through behavioral conditioning, that warmth toward recruits is a form of service. They are not acting. Marcus, a former member who had been an aerospace engineer before joining the New Covenant community in 2007 and leaving in 2014, described this phase with the precision of someone who spent years afterward trying to understand what had happened to him. Within 3 weeks of my first visit, I'd been invited to 6 separate events outside the mall meetings. A dinner at someone's home, a hiking trip, a volunteer day at a food bank that the group organized. Each time there were 20 or 30 people, and every single one of them seemed genuinely happy to see me. Not in the way that feels like recruitment, in the way that you feel when you're around people who actually like you. I hadn't felt that in years. I'd been through a divorce. I worked from home. My social life was essentially my screen. And suddenly here were 40 people who seemed to be exactly the kind of community I'd been telling myself wasn't available to adults in the suburbs anymore. The love bomb phase at the New Covenant community typically lasted between 6 weeks and 4 months, varying with the individual recruit's response rate. Holst had developed, over the organization's years of operation, what former members describe as a remarkable intuition for the right pace, the speed at which intimacy could be escalated without triggering resistance. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily skilled at this. Multiple former members used the word genius in describing his social reading ability, before correcting themselves and noting that genius in the service of manipulation is not a compliment. It's a diagnosis. The boundary test is the inflection point, the moment when the high control organization moves from offering to requiring. It is usually small, almost dismissibly small. That smallness is the design. Former members of the New Covenant community, in the interviews and testimonials that form the public record of this case, consistently describe a moment, usually between the 3rd and 6th month of membership, when they were asked to do something they slightly did not want to do, and they did it anyway because the social cost of refusing felt too high. For Rachel, it was giving her personal email address and phone number to a community coordinator who said the group wanted to stay better connected between meetings. She had initially said she preferred to just keep track through the group's Facebook page. The coordinator, warm, non-pushy, genuinely likable, said it was completely her choice, but that a few members had found it really meaningful to have more direct contact with people. Rachel gave her number. Nothing bad happened. Nothing bad happened for 6 more months. But the number was in a system now, and the system knew things about her patterns of engagement. And when Rachel eventually tried to reduce her involvement, the system knew exactly how to respond to her specific reluctance. David Holst built a data management system for his organization that former members describe as remarkably sophisticated for a mid-2000s small religious organization. Member engagement was tracked. Communication patterns were monitored. Notes from pastoral conversations were recorded. For prayer purposes, members were told, in a centralized system that Holst controlled. The information gathered was used to personalize the recruitment deepening process for each member, to identify what each person needed, what each person feared, and what language was most effective in maintaining each person's commitment. A member who had expressed fear of social isolation received different reinforcement messaging than a member who had expressed fear of meaninglessness. The messages were different. The goal was the same. Isolation in a high-control group rarely happens all at once. It happens the way most profound changes happen, in increments, each individually justifiable, collectively transformative. And the new covenant community didn't tell its members to stop seeing their outside friends and families. It created conditions under which outside relationships became progressively less nourishing than inside ones, and progressively more threatening to the identity that membership had built. The organization's schedule expanded over time. What had begun as Saturday morning meetings in 2004 had, by 2010, become a 7-day-per-week community calendar. Weekday evening small groups, weekend service projects, monthly retreats, daily online devotionals, and a community chat system that generated a constant stream of messages from 6 a.m. to midnight. Members who engaged deeply with the calendar had mathematically limited time for outside relationships. Members who did not engage deeply were gently noted as not yet fully in community, a phrase that carried social weight because full community membership was the source of the belonging that had drawn members in the first place. Marcus, by 2011, was attending approximately 30 hours of community activities per week on top of his full-time remote work schedule. He had not seen his brother in 8 months. He had declined 2 invitations from former colleagues for dinner. He had missed his college roommate's wedding because it conflicted with a community retreat that his small group leader had told him was a critical moment for the group's formation this season. He had not identified any of this as isolation. He had identified it as priority. He had been taught to identify it as priority, and the teaching had worked completely. The breaking point is different for every person who leaves a high-control group, and researchers are careful not to imply a single model, partly because different people reach limits at different thresholds, and partly because implying a clear breaking point can make it seem like people who stayed longer were weaker or less perceptive, which is not what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is that leaving requires the accumulation of something strong enough to outweigh the social, emotional, and sometimes financial investment that membership represents. For Rachel, the breaking point was a specific conversation with David Holst in 2015, in which she was asked, in language she describes as very smooth and very clear at the same time, to contribute $50,000 from her inheritance. Her mother had recently died, to a community building fund that Holst said was necessary for the organization's growth. She said she needed time to think. Holst said he understood and that he would be praying for her discernment. Over the following 2 weeks, 3 senior community members contacted her separately, each expressing concern for her spiritual health and noting that her hesitation around the contribution might reflect an attachment to material security that was worth examining. Rachel made the connection that the concern and the contribution request were coordinated, that the pastoral care she had received for a decade was conditional on her continued compliance, and something, she says, depressurized inside her. She did not give the money, she did not return the following Saturday, she did not answer the calls. David Holst and the New Covenant community were formally investigated by state authorities beginning in 2017, following a complaint filed by Marcus and 4 other former members alleging financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, and in 2 cases, sexual misconduct by Holst toward female members. The investigation led to Holst's arrest in 2018 on charges that included fraud, sexual assault, and filing fraudulent tax returns on behalf of the organization. He was convicted in 2019 on the fraud and tax charges. The sexual assault charges resulted in a hung jury. He was sentenced to 8 years. The New Covenant community ceased operation the day of his arrest. The mall suite was cleared within a week. The shopping mall's management declined to comment. David Holst's conviction in 2019 did not end the New Covenant community's effect on the people who had belonged to it. The aftermath of high-control group membership is one of the least discussed dimensions of this kind of harm, partly because the legal system has no framework for prosecuting psychological exploitation that did not involve financial fraud, and partly because the cultural conversation about cults tends to stop at the dramatic exit and not follow the quieter, longer story of re-entry. Former members have described the experience of leaving as not simply the ending of membership, but the dismantling of a social identity. Inside the organization, they had roles, relationships, a sense of purpose, a framework for understanding the world. Outside it, in a suburb where the second floor of a mall is now a row of empty retail spaces and a storage unit, none of those things existed anymore. The friendships were conditional on shared membership. The framework belonged to Holst. The purpose had been defined by the organization. Rebuilding those things from scratch as an adult, without the community that had been providing them, is a process that therapists who work with cult survivors estimate takes 3 to 7 years on average. Rachel, who left in 2015 and who has spoken publicly about her experience in the years since, said in a recent interview that the most useful thing she learned in her post-membership therapy was the phrase, "that was not my fault." Not as absolution, she is clear that she made choices, but as a reminder that the mechanisms designed to produce those choices were sophisticated, professionally developed, and specifically targeted at her. "I was not naive," she said. "I was targeted. There is a difference." The New Covenant community occupied that second floor mall space for 14 years. For 14 years, 400 people paid membership dues, participated in community activities, and organized their lives around the calendar of an organization that was, at its core, built to serve one man's appetite for control, money, and the specific satisfaction of watching people choose him freely. He is in prison. The mall is intact. The parking lot was repaved in 2021,